Okay, so now let's look at this beauty. The product of cosine of 20, 40, and 80 degrees. They don't have a well-known value like cosine of 30, 60, or 90 degrees. So we cannot just plug their values, multiply them, and that's it. In today's video, I will present you two ways of finding the exact value of the product of cosine of 20, cosine of 40, and cosine of 80 degrees. Let's begin. So the first way. Before we write down a single equation, let's step back and look at the pattern. We don't have any random angles. We go from 20 to 40 up to 80 degrees. So each angle is exactly double the previous one. So from 20 to 40 we double, from 40 to 80 we double. So whenever we see angles doubling in trigonometry, we should immediately say the double angle formula for sine, which tells us that sine of 2x is equal to twice the product of sine of x and cosine of x. Now let's look back at our problem. So we had cosine of 20 times cosine of 40 times cosine of 80 degrees. We see a cosine of 20. To use the double angle formula for sine, we have to multiply the entire product with 2 times sine of 20. But for not changing the problem, we also need to divide by 2 times sine of 20 degrees. So 2 times sine of 20 times, and the rest remains the same, cosine of 20 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees. And all of this is over 2 times sine of 20 degrees. Now, the first two terms by the double angle formula gives us sine of 40 degrees. So we get sine of 40 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees all over 2 times sine of 20 degrees. By multiplying the top and bottom by 2, we get 2 times sine of 40 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees all over 2 times 2 times sine of 20 degrees. Again, the first two terms give us sine of 2 times 40 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees all over 4 times sine of 20 degrees. And by doing the exact same thing all over again, we get 2 times sine of 80 times cosine of 80 degrees all over 2 times 4 times sine of 20 degrees, which will be equal to sine of 2 times 80 degrees all over 8 times sine of 20 degrees. And in the end, this will be equal to sine of 160 degrees all over 8 times sine of 20 degrees. Now, sine of 180 degrees, sine of 160, sine of 160 degrees is equal to sine of 180 minus 20 degrees, which is equal to sine of 20 degrees. By substituting this in our initial expression, we get that our initial product will be equal to sine of 20 all over 8 times sine of 20 degrees. They cancel each other out, and we are left with 1 over 8, which is our final answer. Now for the second way, we are going to use the product to sum formula for cosine. And what's that, some of you may ask? Well, let's start by looking at the cosine of x plus y, which we know that's equal to cosine of x times cosine y minus sine x sine y. Now cosine of x minus y will be equal to cosine x cos y plus sine x sine y. By adding both expressions together, we get that cosine of x plus y plus cosine of x minus y will be equal to cosine of x times cosine of y, and there's a 2 in front, 2 times cosine of x times cosine of y. The terms with signs cancel out. By dividing the new expression on both sides by 2 and rewriting it from right to left, we get that cosine of x times cosine of y is equal to cosine of x plus y minus cosine, there should be a plus, plus cosine of x minus y over 2. So this expression is the product to sum formula for cosine. We go from the product of cosine and y to the sum of cosines, from the product of cosines to the sum of cosines. Okay, now by substituting x being equal to 40 degrees and y being equal to 20 into our new derived formula, we get that cosine of 20 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees is equal to cosine of 40 plus 20 degrees plus cosine of 40 minus 20 degrees all over 2, which is equal to cosine of 60 degrees plus cosine of 20 degrees over 2. It's all known that cosine of 60 degrees is equal to 1/2, so this goes to 1/2, and in the end we get 1/2 plus cosine of 20 over 2, which is equal to 1 over 4 plus cosine of 20 degrees over 2. And now what? Well, now we multiply the entire equation, the entire expression, by cosine of 80. So we got that cosine of 20 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees is equal to 1/4 plus cosine of 20 divided by 2. And by multiplying this entire expression by cosine of 80 degrees, we get that cosine of 20 times cosine of 40 times cosine of 80 is equal to 1/4 plus cosine of 20 degrees all over 2 times cosine of 80 degrees. And by distributing cosine of 80 into the parentheses, we get cosine of 80 degrees divided by 4 plus 1/2 times cosine of 20 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees. For the last two terms, we apply again the product to sum formula, and our expression will become 1 over 4 times cosine of 80 plus 1/2 times cosine of 80 plus 20 degrees minus, we should be a plus cosine of 80 minus 20 degrees all over 2, and that's equal to 1/4 cosine 80 plus 1/4 cosine of 100 degrees plus 1/4 cosine of 60 degrees, which we already discussed, that's equal to a half. So the last term will be equal to 1/2 times a quarter, which is equal to 1/8. Now we know that cosine of 100 degrees is equal to cosine of 180 degrees minus 80 degrees, and that's equal to negative cosine of 80 degrees. By substituting this into our arrived expression, we get 1/4 cosine of 80 minus 1/4 cosine of 80 degrees plus 1/8. Negative cosine of 80 cancels out with positive cosine of 80, and in the final answer for cosine of 20 degrees times cosine of 40 degrees times cosine of 80 degrees will be equal to 1/8, just like the first time. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see more of this every day. Take care. Bye.